Good afternoon and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry and I'm the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. Hey, we are jumping back into our study of Matthew 16, 27, and 28, where we have been demonstrating a first century AD 70 second coming of Christ. Now, excuse me, where I want to go in this video is I want to go back into Isaiah 40 and take a closer look at the context of the coming of Lord in that passage. And here's why. Recall in the last several videos, we have demonstrated that Isaiah 40, and by implication Isaiah 62, which we will get to, stood behind, that is, it served as a prophetic source for the coming of the Son of Man in Matthew 16, 27, and 28. But the context for the coming of the Lord, in other words, the reason for the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 40 is to gather together the elect. It is to gather together Israel unto himself, unto the Lord, to establish the kingdom with them. Therefore, here's the argument. If we can establish when the gathering of Israel takes place, we will have established when the coming of Lord in both Isaiah 40 and Matthew 16, 27 and 28 was to take place. Because after all, to be redundant, the coming of the Lord in both Isaiah 40 and Matthew 16, 27 and 28 by implication is to gather together the elect. So let's do this. Let's take a look at when both John and Jesus place the gathering together of Israel at the coming of the Lord. Go with me to Matthew chapter 3. And this passage is significant because in our last video, if you recall, we connected the message of John with the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 40 and Matthew 16, 27 and 28. Well, we're going to do the same thing again this evening, or this afternoon rather, but we're going to connect the message of John with the gathering of Israel. Notice that John says, let's begin in Matthew chapter 3, verse 7. He had just finished quoting Isaiah 40 concerning his own ministry and his own message. He was the one crying in the wilderness, preparing the way for the Lord, that is, preparing the way for the second coming of Christ. And he turns to the scribes and Pharisees who hear this message and say, in verse 7, "Who warned you, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" Jump down with me now to verse 12. This wrath to come is in the context of judgment, but more specifically, as it relates to the gathering of Israel, it is to separate the righteous from the wicked, the wheat from the chaff, the sheep from the goats. Verse 12, his winnowing fork. Whose winnowing fork? The Lord's, Christ's. His winnowing fork is in his hand. He will thoroughly clear his threshing floor. He will gather his wheat into the barn, but he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. This is the judgment. This is the separation. This is the gathering of Israel. Notice, he gathers together the wheat into the barn. When? At the wrath, at the judgment that was about to come. Okay? That means that the gathering of Isaiah 40 that John was drawing from in this context was about to take place at the coming of the Lord. Let's take a look at another passage. Go with me to Matthew chapter 13. This is obviously a very familiar text. We've looked at this earlier in these studies, but Matthew 13, let me get there. Matthew 13, we have the parable of the wheat and the tares, or the parable of the harvest, as I like to call it. But in this passage, Jesus, again, alluding back to the words of John that we just read, where John says that the Lord would come and as a harvester, he would separate the wheat from the chaff. This is what Jesus says concerning himself when, at the time of the harvest, which was the end of the Jewish age. It says in Matthew chapter 13, verse 30, Jesus says, "Allow both," that is the wheat and the tares, "to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn." Well, what's the wheat? The wheat is the righteous. The wheat is the righteous remnant of Israel of Isaiah 40 and Matthew chapter 3. Both John and Jesus were drawing from the gathering of Israel at the coming of the Lord. John placed it as a wrath, as a judgment about to come upon his generation. Jesus placed it at the end of the Jewish age, which came in AD 70. Now, let's take a look at one more. Go with me to Matthew chapter 24. And again, Jesus, drawing from Old Testament passages concerning the salvation and the gathering of Israel, Jesus came, remember, as a servant to the circumcision to confirm the promises made to the fathers. Jesus was confirming the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy in this passage concerning the gathering together of Israel at the Lord's coming, his coming, which he placed in the lifetime of his first century disciples. Matthew 24, if my computer ever gets to this passage, we will look at it. We're having a storm here today, and I don't even have my Bible, but I'll just say it as it is. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 30, first of all, let's just go back to the context. In Matthew 24, obviously, this context concerns the judgment of Israel, the end of the age, and the coming of the Son of Man. Matthew 24, verse 3. Then Jesus says to his disciples in verse 30 that they, upon seeing the abomination of desolation in their lifetime, that they would see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and the Son of Man would come on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. That's the coming of the Lord. That's the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 40 for salvation and judgment. And at that time, he would gather together the elect. Let me go to Matthew 24, verse 31. It says, and he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four corners, from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. This is the gathering of Israel. This is the gathering of the sheep. This is the gathering of the wheat. As a matter of fact, this passage is perfectly parallel to Matthew 13 and Matthew chapter 3, where Jesus spoke of the gathering together at the end of the age. John spoke of the gathering together of the wheat in the wrath that was about to come. Jesus is speaking about that wrath that was about to come in his generation. He talks about his own coming to gather together the elect of Israel, and Jesus places all of that in verse 34 of Matthew 24 in his generation. Verily I say unto you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. John and Jesus, 3 times in the New Testament, draw from Isaiah 40 and the coming of the Lord to gather together Israel and place that gathering at the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70. That means that the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 40, which was the second coming of Christ, which was the second coming that Jesus drew from in Matthew 16, 27, 28, must have been fulfilled at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Listen, where I want to go next video is I want to take a look at this Greek word that Jesus uses in Matthew 24, 31, which is the gathering together. It is the Greek word episunego. It's used 7 times in the New Testament, but I'm going to look at where it's used in Matthew 24, 31 and where it's used in its counterpart of the Olivet Discourse in Mark 13, 27. And we'll see in both of those passages, Jesus is drawing from other Old Testament prophecies concerning the gathering of Israel, and those passages in the Old Testament that Jesus drew from also places the gathering of Israel at the coming of the Lord in the first century generation. It's going to be powerful. Don't miss it. We'll see you next time on Answers on Eschatology. We'll see you in a couple days. Have a great week. Bye for now.